When you think of elves, do you think of this or this? I really hope it's not this. Are you stupid? For most people, elves were introduced to them through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. Since then, elves have become a media sensation, from movies, books, anime, and video games. TV shows are a bit lacking in that regard. Elves are seen in most, if not all, fantasy media. But where exactly did J.R.R. Tolkien get his inspiration for his elves from? Elven lore is a bit more complex than one might imagine, so let's get into it.
To start, let's talk about mythology and what it is. Mythology can be defined as ancient narratives that attempt to answer the enduring and fundamental human questions. How did the universe and world come to be? Who are we? What are our proper, necessary, or inescapable roles as we relate to one another and to the world at large?
I went to college!
And so on. If we look deep into our mythos and simplify them, it comes down to us trying to explain things we haven't fully understood yet. So where do elves fit in the unknown? Elves in pre-Christian and even post-Christian Germanic countries were described in a more malevolent light than they are today. Elves were thought of to cause illnesses to humans, but were also willing to heal them if given a sacrifice. Those afflicted described feeling sharp internal pains and mental anguish. An example of this is found in the Old English medical text entitled Mythology, where this phenomena is called elf shot. A modern explanation for an elf shot could be rheumatic disorders, cramps, or arthritis. E.O.G. Tervel Petre, or Peter's Myth and Religion of the North, tells of a skin disease for animals called elf burn in English. Elves are even associated with mare, a malicious entity that sits on your chest to bring about nightmares.
Nice.
This is where some people thought elves as being invisible, or small humanoid creatures. In Scandinavian cultures, one could carve out or paint a pentagram on their door, walls, or household utensils to protect themselves from elves. Some would even wear pendants as a form of protection. Protecting yourself from the illnesses elves caused was and still is a huge deal. In 2007, Terry Gunnell, an associate folklore professor at the University of Iceland, found that 37% of participants thought elves were likely to still exist, with 8% stating they definitely did.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's a closet full of handsome.
In my opinion, that's a pretty decent percentage for the modern era. Well, relatively modern. Elves in this era seemingly reflected the panic and unknown of illnesses and pains. They were created as a scapegoat in some lights.
Just as elves are seen as a beautiful race of beings in the modern media, they were also described as such in early texts. Elves were generally split into two categories, light elves and dark elves.
¿Por qué no los das? I says with excitement.
In many texts, such as Prose Edda and Myth and Religion of the North, dark elves are almost used interchangeably with dwarves. The two also dwell deep in the earth, and when Loki cuts Sif's golden hair, he is told by Thor to go to the land of black elves, or dwarves, to forge Sif's golden hair.
I'd look so hot in that.
The Prose Edda, which is argued to have either been written or at least compiled by Snorri Sturluson, describes elves as such. Snorri, perhaps over-schematically, distinguished two kinds of elves, light elves and dark elves. The dark elves were black as pitch and lived underground, but the light elves were more beautiful than the sun and lived in a splendid place called Alfenheim. Snorri seems to describe two aspects of the elves. They are the dead, and at the same time, the promoters of fertility. They are beautiful and hideous at once.
Brother, ugh.
Either the Norse thought of dark elves and dwarves as the same beings, or they used the terms interchangeably. The same effect takes place for light elves as well.
Light elves live in Alfenheim with their king, Freyr. When Freyr was inducted into the Aesir, he was given Alfenheim as a gift. The light elves have been linked to the Vanir, Aesir, and Disir in several poems. Myth and Religion of the North has elves, earth spirits, and dwarves all categorized together under Disir. The Disir are female spirits of deceased female ancestors.
They'll be back.
which is sometimes how elves are described. They can protect families, a particular person, or a piece of land. If they are seen in dreams wearing white, then protection. If they are seen wearing black, death and destruction are near. Freyr being associated with fertility and being the king of Alfheim may confirm elves being linked with nature and fertility.
Even the life-giving sun was sometimes referred to as a ray of elves. The strong link between the godly and elves could mean that they were the same, or, as with dark elves, the term was used interchangeably. Although it is now thought that they used to be on par with the gods, and are now their own separate entity.
Elves and humans were also able to have offspring, and such offspring were told to have extraordinary powers. One such example is the half-elf princess Skuld, who eventually became the Queen of Denmark. She was a great and powerful sorceress who was able to use seer magic. In earlier texts, though, the information of her being a half-elf wasn't included. The saga of Theodoric of Bern and Mythology and Religion of the North, Hugni is described as a half-elf, but the Eddas do not. The interchangeability of being an elf, a half-elf, a light or dark elf makes their mythology very confusing and hard to solidify.
Unfortunately, that's how a lot of old mythology works. Things get mixed up or interpreted wrong in the modern era.
Regardless, the general lore of elves was understood, and the concept of such elves began to slowly shift with the elite culture and the Romantic movement. Elite or high culture societies encompass cultural objects of high aesthetic value that include works of literature, music, art, history, and philosophy. A prime use of the word elf in elite culture art would be Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene.
Unfortunately, Spencer uses the terms fairy and elf interchangeably, and even changes their lore, stating that elves were derived from Prometheus.
William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet also mentions elves and fairies, and just as with Spenser, uses the term interchangeably. Queen Mab, who is the fairy queen, causes elf locks or tangled hair, according to Mercutio.
Regardless, elves or fairies were described as being beautiful and ethereal, which at least follows the original myth. As the Romantic movement began, so did the desire for authentic folklore.
Romanticism is described as an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that emerged in the late 18th century and peaked in the early to mid 19th century. This movement was generally characterized by the emphasis on individualism, emotion, the imaginative, and the transcendental.
During this time, elves were imagined as small, winged people who could live in flowers, very similar to the fairy myth still.
Hans Christian Andersen helped popularize this image, but also changed the image of elves in the Elfin Hill. In this story, elves were described in a more traditional way. They were beautiful, they lived in hills, and they were prolific dancers. This followed the Elven myth a lot more closely than previous literature had.
From there, Andrew Lang's Princess Nobody changed elves again, possibly due to his interest in folklore anthropology. Lang made a clear distinction between fairies and elves. Fairies were small people with butterfly wings, much like the fairies we see today.
Elves, on the other hand, were also small, but with pointed ears, and wore red stocking caps. This description influenced 20th century children's literature and was extremely prominent. A classic example of the tiny elf usage would be Brother Grimm's The Elves and the Shoemaker. Now, the elf was seen as essentially the same as a dwarf, or a brownie, a house spirit who comes out at night to perform chores in exchange for cream or porridge. The elves lightly relate back to their original mythos. They can be mischievous yet helpful. This usage of this version of the elf is echoed in works such as Harry Potter and The Christmas Elf.
The pillar of the elf myth is usually given to Tolkien, but even Tolkien was inspired.
Lord Dunsey's novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, is one of the most influential and acclaimed fantasy novels that popularized the description of elves that we still use today. In this novel, Elfland is described as being beautiful and full of light, just as the king's daughter is also described.
I don't need makeup. I'm already beautiful.
Elves in this world also do not age, just as the elves of the original myth do not. It is highly speculated that Tolkien was inspired by Lord Dunsey's works, along with his own interest in language and mythology. After the tumbling weed of artists inspiring others, Tolkien produced the elf race that we are most familiar with and that is most like the original mythos.
Besides Lord Dunsey's works, most elves portrayed in novels were reduced to gnomes and fairies, a far cry from their original forms. As mentioned earlier, Tolkien had a profound interest in language and mythology.
He initially began his journey on resurrecting the elves through linguistics, something he was quite skilled in. Although it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where Tolkien got inspiration for his elves, since many sources list different forms of media, the Norse mythos seems to be the closest and most accurate. It is speculated that during his World War I service, Tolkien became even more exposed to the media that inspired his poems and novels. One of the last Victorian fairy paintings, The Piper of Dreams, by Estella Canziani, and the illustrated poster of the poem Land of Nod by Robert Louis Stevenson. These pieces of media use the word fairy, which Tolkien also used, but then changed to using elf, probably due to more research and experience with the Germanic language. He was said to be inspired by Andrew Lang, Beowulf, his experience in both world wars, and his prolific language ability.
What's up, guys?
Of course, there are some differences between Tolkien's elves and Norse elves, but that makes sense for an artist creating art. Here are a few differences that I found very interesting.
First, we described elf shots earlier as being responsible for eternal pains, but Tolkien took the term elf shot as meaning elves were great archers. This characteristic for elves is one that's widely used today, and most elven characters are archers. Another difference I found interesting was how he separated dark and light elves. In the Tolkien universe, light elves and dark elves are separated based on if they made the journey to Valinor and saw the light of the two trees of Valinor. If an elf didn't, then they are considered a dark elf, because they hadn't seen the light yet.
What the f*** is this piece of shit?
This take on dark and light elves is fascinating to say the least. There isn't a lot of data yet regarding why elves were separated based on dark and light, besides the obvious good versus evil and gods versus lesser gods.
Elves and other forms of media, especially games, have taken Tolkien's revival of the elven form and made it their own in different ways.
Dungeons and Dragons, The Legend of Zelda, Baldur's Gate 3, World of Warcraft, and so on all feature elves that are similar, yet unique to their media. The same can be said about books, manga, anime, and movies.
I wonder how elves would look today if the few that cared about keeping their original form alive hadn't written what they had.
No matter where one looks in fantasy media, elves play an important role in fleshing out the world.
As what happens to a lot of mythology, the exact reason and description for and what elves are is lost to time. What we do have left is precious, and hopefully more will be discovered about this important myth.
Before I go, I want to dissect elves a bit more. Elves are seemingly elusive, partially due to a lot of Old Norse mythology not surviving into the modern era, and because of what did survive being ambiguous. What I personally believe is that elves reflected the times. In times of illness, elves were to blame. In times of grandeur, elves were seen frolicking amongst the hills and were glistening in the sun. I could most definitely be wrong, but I think elves might have been a more reachable and human form of the gods. What do you think?
That's a thinker.
Hi everyone, thank you so much if you made it this far into the video. I really appreciate it. This video was really fun to do. I feel like I probably missed a lot because a lot was in Old Norse and I don't speak Old Norse nor do I know how to read it. So a lot of it I was relying on other people who have translated it. And this myth is particularly interesting to me because it is everywhere in fantasy media, and yet we don't know 100% what elves are. I mean, we know what elves are, but we don't know what elves are, if that makes sense. If you think about Greek gods in comparison, you know there's so much more for Greek gods than there are for elves, and that is probably, as I had mentioned in the video, the interchangeable words. So it could be that we do know a lot about elves and that they are the gods, or, you know, something like that. But I had a lot of fun, and please let me know if I missed anything that you know, because I am always down to learn. A lot of the myth is probably lost or misinterpreted because of a lot of things being in Old Norse, but also because a lot of stories and pieces of culture are passed down orally. And once you start mixing in cultures and other presence become known, such as Christianity and other religions, it kind of has no need to be passed down anymore, which is really unfortunate, but I think that's probably what happened to a lot of the Elven myth. It could be that it was just kind of just an interchangeable term, but hopefully there'll be more uncovered, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. I'm going to be doing more of these, and please comment if I missed anything and something that you know. Anyways, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye!